Good afternoon and welcome to another Lunch with the Libraries and Museums. This series spotlights the unique collections, pioneering initiatives, and outstanding staff of the Sheridan Libraries and University Museums. My name is Claire Miller, President of the Friends Advisory Council. The Friends of the Libraries are one of the oldest university library support groups in the United States. Since 1931, we have provided financial support, advocacy, and volunteer assistance to ensure that the libraries remain one of the university's strongest assets, the heart of intellectual life at Hopkins. Today's program brings us back to the beautiful Evergreen Museum Library with Dr. Earle Havens, Director of the Virginia Fox Stern Center, and Postdoctoral Fellow, Dr. Martin Michalek. Their presentation, The Ephemeral Renaissance, will showcase Hopkins' collection of single-sheet prints from the late Middle Ages to the Enlightenment and explain what we can learn from these rare pages. So thank you again for tuning in. We hope today's lecture leaves a lasting impression.
Welcome, everybody, to the Evergreen Museum and Library. We're here in the grand, opulent space, perhaps the grandest of all of our rare book spaces at Johns Hopkins University. I'm Earle Havens. I'm the Nancy Hall Curator of Early Books and Manuscripts at Johns Hopkins, and I direct something called the Stern Center for the History of the Book and the Renaissance here at Johns Hopkins, which we have facilities elsewhere in Evergreen. And I'm joined here by my colleague, Martin Michalek, who was formerly a graduate student curatorial fellow of the Stern Center and subsequently took up the role as postdoctoral fellow and is my partner in crime in all things early books.
That's exactly right. Yeah, we call that climbing the ladder of success.
There you go. There you go.
The postdoctoral level.
And this is a singular pleasure for me because we're going to focus on a collection that I've been building for almost 20 years in my time at Johns Hopkins. When I arrived, I had always been interested in what we call ephemera. Okay, so these are things that were printed that actually often don't survive, or if they survive in maybe one example or a handful of examples. And while certain institutions, like, say, the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C., does collect ephemera, they're much more likely to collect ephemera that's about Shakespeare. And I had this thought, well, wait a minute, what if ephemeral print production from the earliest period of the so-called incunabula, or incunabular period of printing, the first 50 years of printing in the 15th century, all the way up to the Enlightenment, if actually there are patterns, if there are genres that lent themselves to single-sheet imprints or pamphlet short-form publications that were almost never bound. And if we collect around that, what kinds of research questions can we ask of the past that we couldn't ask with all of these things scattered to the four corners? This is the power of a collection. A collection can create an entire field of research. Just like our Women of the Book collection here, which we've spoken about in the past, and our Bibliotheca Fictiva collection, which is on the opposite wall from where I'm standing now, the greatest collection of rare books in the history of forgery. And as I've been collecting in this area, and lots of booksellers and have been helping me to build this, I have found that indeed there are particular tropes and forms and norms, shall we say, within the tradition of ephemeral print production that are quite unlike what I would call long-form print production. And so we have some examples. What we thought we'd do is just look at some really great material, some of it unique in the world, and just start giving you a sense of why certain kinds of things become really, really interesting. But the last thing I'm going to say is one of the things that great research libraries do is bring together things that are extremely rare. that the rarity resists scholarly interpretation because these things are literally inaccessible to large bodies of scholars and students of the historical past. And so almost everything in this collection is as rare as hen's teeth, the rarissime, the rarest of the rare. And I'll start with the oldest object in the collection, which is this magnificent 1490 broadside. This is, think about it, this is 2 years before Columbus lands in the New World. And you think about all the things that happened over half a millennium that might conspire to see to the destruction of something that was printed and never actually intended to be preserved permanently. It's something of a miracle. What is this? Well, it is an astrobiological broadside printed in Basel. And actually, there are several other copies of it that survive. Almost all of them are much more fragmentary than ours. Ours is, of the 4 that are known, ours is the most complete. Now, how did it stay preserved? Well, it was recycled. So this is specific to the year 1490. And what it's designed to do is to help you figure out the most auspicious days, as one does, to get your blood let by a doctor. And it also helps to predict that based on your zodiacal, your own, what would we call this? The zodiacal sign under which you were.
Right? Your astrological sign, as they call it.
That's what it is. And
astrological sign.
And it also has a long text which predicts world events that are going to happen in 1490. But unfortunately, when January the 1st, 1491 rolls around and you've got extras of this lying around in the print shop, it's totally useless. It has its own expiration date. And so what happened with this and all the other fragments that survive is that somebody recycled them and used them as binding waste to strengthen a binding for an altogether different book. And so these, this and the other copies were all, shall we say, replevened from these codices, which are actually one of the only places that are the only devices that are actually perfectly suited to the preservation of things that were never meant to be preserved. So that's our oldest ephemeron in the collection. And incunabular broadsides, I think I've seen 5 in my career. So these are the rarest, as I said, the rarest of the rare.
But just as a note too, when we talk about incunabular, we're talking about the first century of print.
Half century, really.
It's a half century, right? So essentially, that period stops the day you hit 1500. So it's not just
or January the 1st, 1501 is technically,
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And incunabula, what does that word mean? Well, it means from the swaddling clothes period or the cradle period of printing. We think Gutenberg invented printing by movable type at some point in the middle of the 1450s, and this is literally just decades after this new technology emerges. So in the middle of the table, we have something a bit smaller and really very early examples in the history of printing of book plates. So this man, Johann Faber, actually, these are both in Latin, and Martin's actually a Latinist. So maybe you can reveal to us what these book plates say.
Yeah, let's have a peek. So book plate, you're trying to show that this book comes from your collection. This is your pride and joy. And you want people to know often who you are, how you got the book. So this is emptus est iste liber per nos doctorum Johannem Fabrum. So this book was bought by me, but it's the royal we, so by us. How you show that you've got something to show off. This book was bought by us, Dr. Johannes Faber. And I mean, do you want me to just kind of, it's got all these different
all the titles. He's the Bishop of Vienna.
Right.
And he's buying, what does it say? And he's buying books from the Archduke of Austria, Ferdinand, who would later become the Holy Roman Emperor, for the Diocesan Library of Vienna, for the use of priests to write sermons and to do other literary work. And then,
yeah, so right here he says, or he writes rather, Donamus igitur eiundems, collegio nostro apud sanctum Nicolum. So we give, therefore, this book to our college at St. Nicholas, so that, ut ibi in perpetuum, so that forever, it may be used by students.
wonderful. That's exactly what we do here at the library. And in fact, I should mention that several of the things that we're going to be seeing are here because of the benefaction of donors to the library, who are also really excited about this collection of ephemera. So this is a very large book plate, and it's the same text as this one, but this is in a black letter German form or Fraktur, which would have been considered perhaps a bit more august looking to a German reader. And then this is in an italic Roman letter form. And the big one would have been used for the big books, and the little one for so this would be folio books, and this might be quartos and octavos. These actually came to us through a bookseller who acquired them from a collector of book plates. Now, if you're interested in book plates as a thing, that's one way of thinking about collecting, but we're super interested in the idea of the ephemeral printing of things that show possession. So these become integrated into a book form, and therefore, happily, they are preserved.
Yeah, I would just add too. It's one thing for a book plate to survive in a book. It's another thing for it to survive having never gone in there. And this is early enough in the history of the book where Western Europe is trying to figure out what language should look like. So is it going to look like this black letter, the kind of Old English, New York Times typeface we think of? Is it going to look crisp and clean, this Roman font moving into italics below? And the answer is that this was kind of what people would have expected a book to look like when you look at a book.
If you were German.
Right, but for a long time, the manuscript tradition that kept these books alive was using this kind of black letter, especially if you're German, yeah. And then this is kind of both the older and the newer fad. So this is the typeface at the top that the Romans used, and then it moves into italics, which was a sleek new font, the Cadillac of fonts, developed so that they could print more per page. Save a buck.
More words could be printed on a page in italic than in a straight unitalicized Roman letter form. So actually, it was a commercial decision by a man called Aldus Manutius in Venice in the late 15th century. And of course, it makes sense to employ it on the smaller format bookplate because you can get the same amount of text, but you can fit it into a smaller space.
And it's not as simple as just, you go into Microsoft Word, you hit select all, you change the typeface. This requires going to a printer and having them draw from upper and lower cases, which is where we get the words uppercase, lowercase, to get different letters to assemble and to put the leading in the right place. I mean, this was a labor of love that, of course, he paid for. He didn't do himself.
And it's so interesting. The year is 1540, and that really is a period of transition, particularly within the Holy Roman Empire, from the Fraktur gradually towards the Roman. By this period, most theological texts were still printed in the Fraktur, more traditional texts, and then ancient texts that were being edited and published often appeared in the Roman letter forms because that's the letter form that the text originally appeared in. Now, these are largely textual, but this one is magnificent. This states we've got to zoom ahead 80 years to the year 1620 and walk up to the Castel San Angelo, just outside of the Vatican City. And every year on the joint festival of Peter and Paul, there would be a great celebration. After all, Peter and Paul are the patron saints, in a sense, of Roman Catholicism itself. The papal bulla, you might have heard of papal bulls. These are little bulls that hang from declarations by popes, and on them they have the face of Peter and of Paul. And on the back they have the name of the Pope. So the Pope very much identified with this holiday as a high holy feast day, and they would make celebrations. So think about this. This is an ephemeron. It's celebrating an occasion, right? And it's an ephemeron that is showing something that is utterly ephemeral. This is a firework display. They're setting off fireworks from the top of Castel San Angelo to celebrate the holiday. And there are a whole array of Romans in their 1620s dress.
Yeah, it's like a photograph. Some of these things are neat and they're neat when you know the story, but then these are just showstoppers where you see it and you know something exciting is happening.
Yeah.
They give us depictions of ordinary people. Can you see who those people are?
So here, there's a little set of tables, and it says pescaria. So this is where you could buy fish to eat during the firework display. And then over here, you have the loco de justicia, which is the place of justice. So on this feast day, certain prisoners would be taken out of Castel San Angelo, and then they would be considered for parole in acknowledgement of the feast day. So as a symbol of the mercy of the church. After all, the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, is sort of like, the head honcho in the city of Rome. And so it ultimately descends from his authority. And then this is called a girandola. It's just the term they used. And then below, engraved into the text, is an explanation of everything that is going on. So why print this? Why create this beautiful etching engraving? Well, so that you can buy it on the way out of the festival and hang it up on your wall or get it framed as a memory of one of the most dramatic events that you may ever experience as a pilgrim to the city of Rome. And if you look at the artifact, you'll see that it was folded in half, and again, probably tipped into a portfolio volume of prints, or perhaps even a large folio book, and thus the miracle of its own survival. One of the earliest dramatically illustrated girandola prints that would continue for a century and a half every year that thenceforth. So this is sort of at the beginning of something. And then the older it is, the earlier it is, the first time around kind of phenomenon, there were just fewer of them made in the first place. So that it's a real miracle of preservation. So we've just switched things out from the three things that we looked at earlier, just to give you a real sense of the sheer eclecticism and variety of ephemeral print culture still in the period of the European Renaissance. And we have here one of Martin's absolutely favorite things in the collection, the Pasquino.
Yeah, so
do you want to tell us?
Of course. These are talking statues. And of course, no statue actually talks. But nevertheless, there's a rich tradition in Rome in particular of finding these ancient statues in the early modern period, putting them in public places, and then plastering what they called cartelli, so these little cards around the statue. So we see here a number of these cartelli, and they're plastered around what is probably a Hellenistic statue, so a kind of Greek period of occupation, Hellenistic statue of Menelaus, who is a hero from the Trojan War. His wife is kidnapped, Helen of Troy. Thus begins the conflict. But that really has no bearing on the scene itself. What happens is this statue is found in ruins outside of the property of a cardinal, Oliviero Carafa, and he brings it out on St. Mark's Day and he puts it in the town for all of the people to enjoy. And slowly this tradition builds up of putting these cartelli around the statue. And a lot of them have words we can't say on TV. They're ways that the voice of the people could get around the official avenues of communication in the time. So you're getting away from censorship, you're getting around the printing press, you're getting around church leaders who are facilitating the movement of print. And naturally what you find are caustic insults, gossip about political and religious figures, smack talking, as we would say. Who's Pasquino? How did his name become affiliated with the statue? We have no idea. The folk tradition is that Pasquino was a tailor who was known for insulting people. But that's apocryphal, as we say in the business. There's no evidence.
What
of
are
that.
these devices over here on the foreground?
Yeah, so these are the accoutrement, the bric-a-brac, the signs of celebration that we find on St. Mark's feast day, which they observed on October 25th. It's possible that they could have been thrown there by someone who's just written something bawdy and run off. And then another thing I really like is you can see these everyday people in the background. So you see the ruins of ancient Rome populated with the inhabitants who called it their home back in 1540 when this was printed.
Yeah, and it just reminds us that at the same time there's this printed tradition of ephemeral production, there's still ongoing a manuscript version of that culture. And fortunately, a number of people collected and transcribed these inscriptions, these pieces of paper, and they published them as an anthology. And you can see a whole we have in our rare book collection a whole gathering of these so-called pasquinades. This is where the literary tradition of the pasquinade comes from Pasquino in the city of Rome.
Yeah, that's right. And the talking statue phenomenon spreads. So if you were trying to nip it in the bud by moving this statue and getting people to stop spreading their gossip, soon enough copycat statues appeared, and people were plastering these cartelli around any ancient statue in a public place.
So there's an idiosyncratic representation of how ephemerality becomes part of the urban landscape, quite literally. But then there are other sorts of ephemera that are utterly occasional and indeed miraculous. And that is a good summary of this extremely rare broadside printed in 1620 in Sevilla in the south of Spain. Now, it's commemorating something that happened. There was a armada of Spanish ships that was leaving Acapulco to head to China, in part to try to convert people in East Asia to the Roman Catholic religion. But the armada sank in a terrible storm. And that was seen as a terrible omen to the Spanish people. It's an immense loss. The most valuable objects in the world were galleons. They were the supreme military tool of projecting military power in the world. And actually, exactly at that time, there was a slave, Anton of Mozambique, who was working in the orange orchards of a tenant of a Spanish aristocrat, the Count Olivares, and he is hewing orange wood in the orchard, and he chops into a tree, and miraculously he sees inscribed inside the tree's bark 2 crosses that are clearly, according to the text, a demonstration of God's providence, that even though this great armada was lost, God will continue to share the message of Christ's sacrifice in the world. And so it's this miraculous sighting of showing God's hand in the physical world in which we live is also, of course, very exciting. You think of some of these little magazines that you see as you check out of the grocery store about Elvis being spotted in the building and that sort of thing. It's also a bit of a tabloid thing. And what's interesting about this is it was hand colored in this brown to make it look like the bark of a tree. So these kinds of revelations are another form of ephemeral production. Now, this is possibly my favorite piece. When I acquired it, the bookseller who had it, I don't think, studied the image closely enough. This is a Dutch broadside, also from the year 1620, printed in Amsterdam. And it's a poem which is making fun of an Arminian. Now, Arminians were like very high church Protestants who other Calvinists in Holland all thought of as so-called popish Protestants, or they were too close to the Roman Catholic tradition of religious observance. And so it's a satire. And so in a sense, it's satirical in some of the same ways that the Pasquino is. But So you have here in the front a friar with the ears of a donkey, and then another figure who is a fool. And they are putting the ears of a donkey on top of this Armenian figure in the city. And in front, you'll see this very elaborate monstrance in which you would hold the host. And it was Calvinists would consider these things to be the instruments of popery and that kind of thing. But then if you look in the back, you actually see something that is extremely rare in the history of early modern graphic arts. You see a representation of a colporteur, of a person who literally wanders around the city of Amsterdam selling ephemera to people. And he's standing there with a basket which is over his shoulders, and inside are all these little pamphlets. He even has a pamphlet stuck in his headband, okay? But, so the bookseller noticed that, but they didn't notice is that hanging from the very front of his basket is this whole broadside. So there's a broadside, and inside is the broadside. My friend Johan Osterman at the University of Nijmegen said it's like a droste moment. And if anyone here drinks hot cocoa and you've got droste hot cocoa, there's always an image on the box of people drinking hot cocoa, and inside is the cocoa. So it's kind of like a meta experience of ephemerality in all of its complexity and human interest.
You know, what's remarkable too is so this is 1620.
Yeah.
So we are just 80 years removed from Pasquina. And yet the difference in their ability to depict things in imagery through these engravings, through these etchings, has grown so considerably. This picture looks so much more, to use an anachronistic term, photorealistic than the Pasquino statue, because that technology is just moving.
So you go from
quickly.
a copper plate to what's called etching. And so they would have actually had a copper plate, and they would have had a wax ground on it, and they would have exposed parts of the copper plate and pour acid over it. And you get these super deep cross-hatching passages in the image that you could never have achieved in the earlier period. So ephemera also is very interesting. It becomes a kind of register also of the transformation of the graphic medium itself. And clearly they decided to spend a lot of time making this elaborate image so that they could express these ideas at a minute level in a way that you wouldn't in the earlier periods.
Well, we've refreshed the table for a third and final time with some different goodies. We're moving forward. We're firmly in the 17th century now. And we can start here with this sundial. So this is 1675. This is the era we think of as still firmly in the early modern period. But what I really love about this object is in it we see the early modern period kind of giving way to the Enlightenment, to all the scientific revolutions that are about to reorient the world. And I say that because this is already an anachronistic technology when this is printed. So this is a sundial. It's printed for one person in particular. You can see here in the dedication to whom it goes. So in Latin, Dominum Vincentium Butarum, who is Vincenzo Butari. So this sundial was printed for Vincenzo. We don't know that much about him as a figure. We only have this single instance of this sundial, though you can see that the copper plate was reused for a different sundial that's similar image, slightly different accompanying text. These function something like footnotes to the sundial, whereas this has the sundial bordered with instructions on how to use it. And as the instructions explain in Latin, there are 3 different timekeeping devices here. So we have Babylonian time, we have Italian time, and we have the planetarium. And what this device asks one to do is to take nails, and each nail is going to function as a gnomon, which is the needle that the sun moves around to cast a shadow. And what one does is strike those nails into the hands of Christ and then into the feet. And one places it on a south-facing wall. This is all in the instructions. And it catches the rays of the sun. And as the sun moves around from east to the southern sky to the west, the shadows are going to move in these different clocks. So what is a Babylonian clock? I'm so glad you asked. A Babylonian clock measures time from sunrise to sunrise. And that's because timekeeping technology, so the ancient Greeks and Romans believed correctly, came from Babylon. The Italian clock, on the other side, Christ's hand, measures the day from sunset to sunset, from vesper to vesper. So this is also called church time. And what's nice is when you combine them, measuring the day sunrise to sunrise and sunset to sunset, you never need to readjust your timepiece. At the time that this is coming out, pendulum clocks are becoming more popular. In fact, in the very same year as this, 1675, the pendulum clock becomes portable. Don't ask me how, not my area of expertise. But I bring that up to say that this is a religious object in a world that's starting to see a divide coming between science and religion. And there's a third clock at the very bottom here that they've called the planetarium. And this is the kind of deliberately anachronistic clock that they've included. What this does is it measures the day in 12 hours. So no matter what time of year it is, no matter how long the day is, how short the day is, that day is going to get divided into 12 equal hours, or rather unequal hours, as the timekeeping is sometimes called. And the reason that this is on here, as the instructions in this other extant sundial tell us, is because that was the time that's in the Bible. The time of the Bible was talking about the day in 12 hours. So they've put this on here to help you imagine as you're going about your daily life, when you're taking lunch, when you're having dinner, you can imagine based on different scriptures what Christ would have been doing at the same time.
So yeah, we sometimes refer to these as paper tools. And we have many paper tools in the collection. We have broadsides with volvels that turn and you can make calculations. This is a particularly rare kind of a thing where somebody has turned a practical timekeeping device into a devotional scene where you contemplate, as you register through the sundial the time of day, you're also contemplating the fact that you are going to die eventually and be judged and go to heaven or hell, and in the Roman Catholic dispensation. And so it combines religion and science in a sense, which would have been normal to people to do in the 17th century. They wouldn't have seen a divide between them. And so it's a wonderful example of the kind of hybridity of the cultural imagination in the early modern period. Now, what kind of ephemera is what's one of the most common forms of ephemera to show up on a wall? Well, if not a calendar. Maybe many of you might have a calendar hanging on the side of your refrigerator. But believe it or not, they used to make them long ago. This is one of the largest objects in the Ephemeral Renaissance collection, and it is one of only 2 copies that survives. The other is at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris, and this is printed in France. It's an absolutely spectacular, enormous 2-page hinged broadside that's a calendar for the year 1671, so just a few years before these. And so again, the passage of time, and if you look at the calendar, you'll see that there are certain dates printed in black and certain in red, and the red dates are the ferial dates, or the dates of feasts of saints and other figures in history, of people from the Bible and so forth. Now, this is Louis XIV, the Sun King, right? This is the guy who pretty much invented the idea that the king should be the absolute epicenter of all aspects of being French. And here he is with his wife, Maria Therese. And he was the one to perfect this idea of a highly rigid order. The importance only the most important people could be close to the king and the queen, to the person of the king and the queen. I mean, the court would come and assemble at the king's bedroom to watch him eat breakfast. You know, I mean, this was the world in which they lived. And you can actually see all these figures close to the king and the queen, and those are actual portraits of courtiers. So is this really a calendar? Or is this a piece of royal propaganda of the first water? And I would say it is definitely the latter. You can barely read the calendar. The type is so small. They literally produced as small a calendar as they could to emphasize the absolute importance of the monarch. So it's interesting how these ephemera can have both practical applications, understanding which are the most important days of the year to be aware of, but then also to be an absolute work of political propaganda. You can think of, in dictatorial countries where ministers of state will all have a portrait of the dictator in the back of their office. Well, that's kind of what this is. A magnificent object. I'm going to close with something super humble. And it's actually a bit of really good news for the Stern Center here at Johns Hopkins and the Sheridan Libraries. Many, many decades ago, more than I care to remember, when I was a graduate student, I actually worked on a bibliography of a unique collector who collected all the ephemera that he could get his hands on in the city of London between the 1670s all the way to the 1730s. So he collected ephemera for 50 years. He had possibly the largest collection of early modern ephemera ever compiled. His name was Narcissus Luttrell. He was a parliamentarian. He actually wrote one of the longest diaries from the late 17th century, ironically called A Brief Relation. Anyway, so he would not only acquire broadsides, or in this case, a very short pamphlet, but he also put the price he paid, which is something we almost never get to know, what the price of something was over time. He also corrects the date. Sometimes broadsides don't even have any date. And so we just have to guess. But thankfully, with Luttrell, as you can see here at the bottom, he took the year 1705 and wrote 2 January 1745, because they didn't change the date on January the 1st in this period in history. They waited till Lady Day, which was later in the year. And so this is not from the year 1705, but from the very beginning of 1704, towards the tail end of the previous year. And then, which is really important, is that often this is a poem on affairs of state. They don't actually tell you who wrote the pamphlet, often because they're a lot like pasquinades. They're kind of naughty. But fortunately for us, Luttrell said this is by John Phillips Gentleman. And sometimes when you go into the text, he'll correct the text, or he'll add the names of people who are also figures who are named as mythological people, perhaps, but he's naming the people they actually are at court. So Narcissus Luttrell was an incredibly important person for the study of ephemera. So when I was a graduate student, I helped to publish a bibliography of about 3,400 individual ephemeral objects that he dated and named and priced. And I never stopped looking. So over the ensuing 25 years, I and a colleague, Alvin Bregman, have now found over 5,000 of these dated ephemera, which are incredibly important for scholars. Well, we've just learned from the National Endowment for the Humanities that the Stern Center has been awarded a $318,000 2-year grant to actually pull all of this material together, to create an online relational database, and to mine that data so we can sort of unlock some of the practical historical issues behind ephemera, like looking at price fluctuation, comparing the prices of ephemera that are not illustrated versus ephemera that are illustrated. And then to do all sorts of other analysis to see if there were certain kinds of printers that specialized in ephemeral print production versus others. So I'm happy to end on a very positive note. So you'll have to tune in. Maybe in a couple of years we'll do something like this about Narcissus Luttrell. But thank you all for coming. And I know Martin and I are happy to answer any questions that you might have. This is your opportunity to get your burning question about early modern ephemera answered by two people who've been working intensely on this collection now for several years together. Everybody, thanks so much for sharing with us this amazing collection of the ephemeral Renaissance. I just saw in the chat Henry's question about the use of multiple styles and sets of type. It is indeed the case that different printers had different kinds of type. They would have italic when they wanted to get lots of letters on a page, as we talked about earlier. But if you think about the transition, the gradual transition that Martin was talking about with those book plates from a Gothic or what we call fracture letter form to a Roman letter form, there were certain printers who had both. Very famous one was Badius Essentius, who was a printer in the Swiss cantons. And he would print lots of theological books in the fracture because theological books were associated with the medieval tradition in a sense. But he would also print humanistic books like Pliny the Elder and other ancient authors, and would print those in Roman form. So it's kind of interesting how the consistency of both over time, that there were, in a sense, different markets for, different sorts of people with different cultural expectations.
Could I jump in
Yeah.
here and add that early books, like any technology that's new to take form, it has to kind of imitate the thing it's replacing. So early books are trying to look like manuscripts, which in Western Europe are using black letter, right? The ye old typeface we think of in the New York Times. We have a print that details the sack in our Ephemeral Renaissance collection, the sack of two twin cities we all know and love, Buda and Pest, before they became one Budapest. And it's a bilingual print. One side is in Latin, one side is in German. So two linguae francae of the period. Latin is in Roman type, and German is in black letter. So you can see that even well into the early modern period, which is when this is printed, these are functioning kind of like accents on the page of what the sort of cultural cachet of a specific language is. So the Germanic languages continue to look like black letter for a long time. And then lastly, I would just add that when Greek typefaces are created, those Greek typefaces in Western Europe are being designed to imitate the handwriting of Byzantine scholars. And all of these, including Hebrew typefaces, would have been sitting in the best printers' workshops.
Yeah, and in a sense, then, there are multiple visual literacies at work at any one time. In fact, there were often learned people would have multiple forms of handwriting. They might have what we call a secretary hand, which is like a informal hand, but then they might actually also then know how to write in less cursive ways, depending upon the audience and the purpose. But I see Cindy has a question that prints tended to be heavily one color, aside from a few red letter spots we call rubrics, which are designed so that to guide you through the document so you can read where the different sections begin. But Cindy's question, do we know if this tended to be an economic decision, this heavily one color kind of quality of these ephemera? Was this intended to be an economic decision for the printer? Or is it a sign of the age of the document? I think, Martin, you could answer that one.
Yeah, I'd love to answer that question, which is a really good question, because obviously in this period, they're living in Technicolor. They see color all around them. And as much as they might want to recreate it, they're kind of limited by the technology of the time. And here I think a helpful parallel is early 20th century films or 19th century and early 20th century photographs, which of course are in black and white. those photos get colored sometimes to try and show us what, World War II looked like in color. You see that in the early modern period too. So to back up, the ink that they're using is called iron gall ink. What you do is you take oak trees, you take oak galls, you soak them in water, you remove the tannins, kind of like when you make tea, and then separately you take ferrous sulfates and you dissolve those in water. After about a day, you mix those and you have your black ink. But no inks are the exact same. Everything is artisanal. It's not like our laser jet printers where they can recreate the same color all the time. These inks, because they're all made differently, they age differently. So they all tend to brown as they age. And some of them, which are too acidic, which are too ferrous, will start to eat through the paper. All of this is to say that different prints we have, sometimes from the same printer's shop, will now look a little different because the inks are different shades of brown. But there was a practice of taking books and prints and anything on the page from this period and hand coloring them, often with watercolor. Sometimes that was done before you bought the book. Sometimes you did that to your book. This was skilled labor, often performed by women and children. So there's a collaborative process in getting these documents to look the way they did then, and then they change as they age.
Yeah. And I see Cindy has a follow-up to that, a more technical question. Was it common to have multiple printing processes in a single piece of ephemera? And the answer is absolutely yes. Now, in some cases, and it was very expensive, they might engrave an image and engrave the text. So when you saw the Girandola, the firework display at Castel San Angelo, the author actually, the artist, engraved the text to explaining the thing above.
Backward too.
Yeah,
Amazing.
and you have to do it backwards because the intaglio process requires that everything is backwards. So you literally are writing, you're like Leonardo da Vinci, you're writing backwards. Anyway, but it's much more economic to actually, like the Armenian one with the satire with the image of the colporteur in the back, of printing the letterpress and then printing the image separately. So letterpress are the individual letters of every word lined up in a compositor's stick and placed into a letterpress printing press. And then that is very different than how the engraving is illustrated. The engraving goes through a roller press. So it's two processes that are required in order to create that artifact. In some cases, you might have all of the letterpress printed by a certain printer, and then all the sheets are taken to somebody who specializes in illustration. But in Amsterdam, so much was illustrated because the finest engravers in the world were basically working in the early 17th century in Amsterdam, that they might have both printing processes in the single shop. So that's kind of my reply to that. And now Vivian asked, did these ephemera get the same level of respect and interest for historical research as long form books? I don't know, Martin, what do you think about that?
If not now, then soon enough. Collections like these are kind of new in the world of collecting, especially at the university level. But there's been a push in the academy within the last several years to get away from the kind of great man notion of history where we're studying famous individuals and how they shaped the world, and to get down to the nitty-gritty lives of everyday people. And I kind of think of correct me if you think something differently, but the ephemerality of printing back then gets us to the everyday world because these can be bought by people who can't read. They're cheap. They can be made cheaply and therefore sold cheaply. And for printers, this is a huge advantage because if you're creating a Bible, that's going to take you forever to print. You're losing money every day, but you can recoup some of those losses with these sheets. All this to say, if they're not getting the attention that they deserve now, I think they will because they tick so many boxes of what we as scholars want to know about the past. What did everyday people's lives look like. And these prints both depict them, they were marketed for them, and they abound in ways that are unexpected and haven't been studied yet. So as we're looking for new fodder for our scholarship, these are going to play a huge role there.
Right. I think canonicity, studying the great books has been a tradition all around the world for a very long time. But this kind of ephemera, which is also not getting as much respect because it's so hard to find. Like if you go into a library catalog, you can't just put in the word ephemera. Like they don't catalog it that way. It's hard enough even to find a single sheet imprint, like a broadside. They don't even use those words in standard cataloging language. So a lot of these objects are kind of hidden in plain sight in libraries. And again, the power of a collection that is purposely drawing attention to this phenomenon as an aspect of print culture and a kind of singular form of knowledge production is what is the reason why we can even conceive of thinking about ephemera as a scholarly subject in the first place. Michael asked, were there any printings of astronomical things like phases of the moon and appearances of Venus and Jupiter and the like? And the answer is yes.
Boy, oh boy.
Yeah, because
things.
Because they're ephemeral, right? Like they happen in short periods of time. We have a fabulous broadside published in the early 17th century in Germany. Now, there's only one other copy of it, and it's hand colored, and it's like showing this movement of sunspots over a period of like a couple of weeks. And it obviously is basically like read all about it. Sunspots discovered,
Let's remember Galileo was put on house arrest
Yeah.
for observing sunspots and talking about them. So there's a real shift of public interest in science.
Right.
And you want to see it in print.
And it was like just a year after the sunspot book that Galileo produced was made, and it was only printed about 40 miles south of the university of the Jesuit German scholar who also discovered sunspots independently of Galileo, but was too late in print to claim supremacy as the discoverer. So there's this sense of capturing new knowledge and popularizing it. And this was not supposed to happen. Spots were not supposed to move across the sun. Everything beyond the four sublunary spheres, everything below the sublunary spheres, everything above it was perfect and never changing. So it was like all of a sudden, wow, the universe is changing all the time. Let's announce it with a broadside.
Right. And the Copernican revolution, which helps people predict when these celestial phenomena are going to happen. Boy, oh boy, does that sell well on the printing press, because now you can know when something is going to happen celestially because it's been printed. The Farmer's Almanac is really taking off.
Yeah, and another subgenre, Michael, in this tradition is the appearance of comets. So we have several illustrated comet broadsides with an accumulation of observations made by multiple people around the world, with graphic illustrations of the direction of the comet. One of them looks like the first version of the Nike swoosh as it passes through the sky in this 17th century engraving, which is enormous and fascinating. We have another question from Lewis. Do we have any idea how much these prints and calendars would have cost? Well, the answer is no. We have a very meager understanding of that, except through Narcissus Luttrell, the guy we just got this big grant to study. He put a price on everything over a 50-year period. If a single sheet broadside was printed in London in 1679, almost always they cost 1 pence, so a penny, which back then was more than a penny now. I mean, we're getting rid of the penny, I think, in this country soon. But, maybe a couple dollars, But if you add an illustration, thanks to Luttrell's pricing, you can see that it could quadruple the price of a single sheet imprint. And then over time, you also find that broadsides that were super controversial, like that came up in a debate in Parliament because it was conceived to be seditious. If Luttrell hadn't bought a copy of that, he would end up spending like $50 to get one because it must have been something he needed to know about. Because he was a member of Parliament and he would have known. Is there a gallery of these online of the ephemeral Renaissance? The answer is yes. If you go to the Virginia Fox Stern Center website and you go under the drop down that says early book collections, you can select the ephemeral Renaissance and you'll see essays by Martin and myself and by the graduate student curatorial fellows here at the Stern Center. It'll also have an overview of the collection. So there's an essay there about Pasquino that Martin was talking about earlier, and you can see high resolution images that you can click on and download on all of these things. And we just continue to add these kind of interpretive essays through the work of the Stern Center Curatorial Fellows.
I would also just note that we've hosted events at the George Peabody Library where we bring out these collections and we sometimes make facsimiles of them. So we made a facsimile of a kind of early modern supercomputer that can predict celestial phenomena. Just this past spring, we made facsimiles of the crucifix sundial that we saw. So we try to get these things out into the public, either through the website, through these making events in Baltimore, and of course, they're right here at Evergreen. So if anyone is interested in coming to see them, we can set up tour dates.
Yeah. Now, our ephemeral revels have now ended. We're at the conclusion of our hour of talking about this endlessly fascinating material that has for so long been thought of as throwaway and cheap and not important. And we're suddenly beginning to see as a group, as a community, that these things are absolutely essential to our understanding of the intellectual landscape of human experience. And it's really, Hopkins is one of the only places where you can really ask these questions and get answers from the objects themselves. But I just want to thank my colleague Martin for joining me here today and as my co-conspirator in bringing the Ephemeral Renaissance collection to the world. And I want to thank you all for allowing us to share these treasures of the Sheridan Libraries with you and the Hopkins community. I'd also like to thank everyone here who's tuned in to listen to us talk about this. We were a little worried that if the word ephemera was used, you might not even be interested. Like, oh, well, that's just ephemeral, like trivia or something. But I hope that you have a different sensibility about these objects. And then for more information and to register for future virtual programs like this, visit the hopkinsathome.jhu.edu site, and then you can tune in for future biblio tourism of the first water, thanks to the greatness of the collections of our university. So thank you all for coming and have a wonderful weekend.